Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Disruptive Innovation Festival open mic session with the Circle Economy. This is the second of the Circle Economy sessions during the Disruptive Innovation Festival. Earlier this week, we heard about how and why the Netherlands is becoming a circular hotspot. That session was recorded, and you can watch it again now just by visiting thinkdiff.co. Today, we'll be hearing about the perceived legal barriers to circular economy business models. Before I hand over to Ariana and Mark from the Circle Economy, I'd just like to tell you about a couple of other sessions we've got coming up at the Disruptive Innovation Festival today. So at 3 p.m. we have How the Sharing Economy Could Change Wealth Inequality, and that's with Alex Stephanie of Just Park. And straight after that at 4 p.m. we'll have the biorefinery at DSM in the context of the circular economy, so a business viewpoint, big business viewpoint of how the circular economy could shape how the business operates in the future. But for now, I'd like to hand over to Ariana and Mark of the Circle Economy to discuss this topic, the legal barriers, perceived legal barriers to circular economy business models.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thanks for having us here, and thank you for the introduction. And also another party I want to thank is the Seeds to Meet location that we're at. It's a really nice example of sharing economy. They have a Google Hangout studio that we're allowed to use. So, and as we see the sharing economy as a part of circular economy, that's really great that we can do that here today as well. My name is Ariana van der Plas. I'm the communications manager of Circle Economy, and right next to me is Mark de Wit, also project manager at Circle Economy. He will introduce himself a bit later. And Circle Economy, we're a member-based organization in Amsterdam, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. One of the things we find, and that we'll talk about in the next 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the amount of bright questions that you ask us, is the legal barriers that are there or that are perceived to be there when you start working on circular business models. We've been on a journey the last 6 months, I guess, to find out more about how that works in the Netherlands. And Mark will tell you a bit more about that in a minute. So he will start with a presentation of about 20 minutes, and after that there is room for questions that you can, of course, already share with us via the Hangout or via Twitter. So I guess I'll be handing over the floor to you, Mark.
Yeah. Thanks, Ariana, for the introduction, and welcome also from my side to this webinar. Yeah, my name is Mark de Wit. I work as a project manager with Circle Economy, and with that we start up circular projects with our members. We have about 25 projects currently in the air, and that looks at, for example, biorefinery kind of concepts that were just mentioned, but also a lot of others. And doing these projects with the members, we not only come to challenges within the boundaries of those companies, but also see overarching challenges, cross-sectoral barriers that we see. And one of those that we came across for the past year, I think, in a number of cases, were legal barriers. So obviously, in the process of transitioning towards a circular economy, whole society needs to change. And I think one of the aspects of disruptive innovations, where we're talking about in this in the range of these webinars, is by definition are innovations that take place in a setting that is not entirely right for that innovation to take place. That's the disruptive nature of it. And that also goes for laws and regulations. To mention one example, when you look at a circular economy, one of the ground principles is obviously that you want to reuse secondary waste streams. So you actually don't want to talk about waste, whereas there's a whole bunch of laws and regulations focused only on waste and what to do with it, how to transport it, etc. So there are several topics, you might say, where laws and regulations play a very important role to manage things and to keep things in place in society, but also where it sometimes hampers further development. And what I want to talk with you about today is a very concrete example of such a legal barrier, and that is legal barriers that are sometimes perceived and sometimes actually there when it comes to transitioning to leasing models or pay-per-use models or access over ownership kind of models, whatever you want to refer to them. And one of the reasons within a circular economy that we want to move to those kind of business models is that as a producer, using a lot of raw materials to produce a product, push that into the market, then it's being used, and at a certain point it comes to the end of life. And what you now see in many parts of the world is that that ends up in a landfill, or is incinerated, or in any other way is not being used to reused to a very high value, so it's not being upcycled. And laws and regulations play a big role there. So that's one of the basic ideas why you would want to have such a model, that as a producer, as a manufacturer, you're actually responsible also for the end of life. And because prices rise on world markets, you would also want to keep those to yourself rather than having to purchase them on the world markets time and again. So there are several arguments that you could think of for certain materials where this pay-per-use kind of business model would make sense. But that's not the topic of today. So what I would like to focus on is some of the legal barriers that we found. And for that, I'm gonna start up my presentation. And Ariana is very helpful in assisting in that.
Yes, there you go.
Because one of the things I would like to talk about today is, well, the legal barriers, the perceived legal barriers for moving, what I would say, moving from a box pushing to a pay-per-use business model. So box pushing, as a manufacturer, you produce a product, you push that onto the market, and with selling that to the consumer gives you the money, the consumer then gets the product. So it's in a sense a transaction. Whereas if you go to a pay-per-use business model, the whole nature of that relation changes. So rather than having that transaction, you actually engage in a longer-lasting relationship with one another, which has clear advantages, as just mentioned, but could also potentially have some drawbacks. So let me explain a bit more. So what are the consequences for this relation between the supplier and the end users? There are clear consequences. Well, as I just said, so instead of this single transaction, the supplier and consumer will engage in that longer lasting engagement, and yeah, so that's one of the basic features of the model. But then the question is, to what extent can you also finance such a model? And that's actually one of the questions that arose in doing this project. So how are we going to get this financed? And then you come to the issue of what happens in terms of the ownership of the materials. With who does the ownership reside in such a model? And there are very interesting observations to make there. So one of the changes is in changing from the box pushing to the other model is that it is shifting, and one of the legal ramifications of that construction is that is it possible for the supplier to remain owner of these materials? And let's look at that, because in law there is a sharp distinction between movable and immovable property, or in UK English, chattel property versus fixture. And typical movables are, for example, desk chairs, desks, plants that you may have in your office. And immovables include ventilation, heating and cooling installations, etc., which are really fixed in a way to your office. So now move to the example of the lamp. When a lamp, so an immovable property, is fixed to the office and to the superstructure of the building, that lamp becomes part of the building through a process that in legal terms is called a cession. And the criterion used to distinguish whether it is movable or immovable is whether the physical properties, so whether that lamp is attached to the ceiling and can be removed without damaging the original property. So this is really one of the basic legal elements. So accession, so when a smaller good is attached to a bigger good, it becomes part of that bigger good. And in the example of, for example, Philips supplying a lamp to an office, you can have the situation that although Philips would like to remain owner of that lamp, that because it is attached to the ceiling, the legal ownership shifts to the consumer. And the question is, what kind of risks does that introduce, both to the party that's financing, so potentially a bank, to Philips, but maybe also the consumer. And I would like to say a couple of things about that, and I will go to the right slide for that. So when it is clear that the ownership cannot stay with the supplier, then the question is what does that do for the financing of the project? And well, being not a legal professional working on this project, I learned quite a lot of insight, and one of those is how bankers look at financing these kind of things. And there are basically two. So one is the cash flow that is generated over the course of the project, and the other is the value of the asset, so in this case the lamp. And the question is, which of these two aspects is more important to consider to satisfy how financiers look at this? So is that the cash flow or is that the asset value? And let's assume for a moment that it is especially the asset value that is most important to consider. Then you might wonder, well, what happens if this asset is of so much use to a banker because it wants security? So when you have a contract between Philips and someone owning a lamp, when you have that contract and that contract for whatever reason is terminated, you can always fall back to that asset that represents a certain value, and you can make use of that. But what happens in the case that we have identified now, where actually the ownership does not reside with Philips anymore? Does that pose a problem? And this is actually the key question that a number of people along this project ask themselves. There is a real discrepancy between the security that you want to have in having that asset and the fact that you cannot remain a legal owner of that. So in that sense, you may want to say, well, there is indeed a legal barrier. But I want to explore further, as we did in the project, to see if you can work around those kind of barriers. So let me continue this reasoning, focusing on asset value and cash flow, and now shift to cash flow, because in the end, that's really where money is being earned. So from a banker point of view, that's really where you want to have it secured. So is the fact that this legal ownership does not reside with Philips, is it a real problem? And the answer can be maybe not. Because what is the way in which we in society deal with these kind of things now? It is by entering into a contract between Philips and between a consumer or between another company. And in that contract, you specify that you will pay for this service, that the supplier will supply this service. And you can even take up in such a contract that whenever you're not able to pay anymore, that the supplier can take back its materials and sell those on the market or install them with another consumer, and then can generate cash flow again. So the fact that you can use this contract just between a supplier and a consumer may be a very obvious workaround to go around the problem of the fact that there's not a legal ownership with Philips. And when we were speaking about these things with some of the lawyers from Allen & Overy, with whom we did this project, they referred to a phrase which is quite common in law, pacta sunt servanda, meaning agreements must be kept. In other words, although the legal ownership is lost, through this accession, they can still be at least the economic owner of it, which may solve a lot of these questions. Ariana, did you want to break in? Or?
I was thinking that maybe it's the next sheet that says that.
I
wasn't sure, so I wasn't ready to to actually go there.
So yeah, this is just a workaround. So this indeed is well, this contract that I was mentioning. So that can actually be a way of going around well, these issues. But then there's another question, and that's something else that I learned, which is that lawyers like to perform the bankruptcy test, as they call it. And the bankruptcy test, what it already implies is, well, in case that an office or a company or a consumer goes bankrupt, what happens then? And well, there are several things that start getting into action then, and one is that when you go bankrupt, a liquidator takes your place and has a look at the possessions that you have and see if it can sell those possessions to fulfill any outstanding debts that you might have. And in that capacity, the liquidator has the relative freedom to make choices in what contract it wants to continue and which of these he wants to terminate. And while the liquidator may decide to, for example, call off the gardener that cleans your garden every now and then, he will probably continue paying for your electricity because that enables him to use his computers, also to continue having light in the office, etc. And as it actually now stands in this example, for lamps, the liquidator might actually say, well, we're going to terminate this contract that provides us with the lamps, because as long as I pay for my electricity, I will be able to have light anyway. And that obviously is, well, very sound reasoning. So there are two main ways of looking at this bankruptcy test and see if there are workarounds to look at how can we overcome those. So yeah, here, let me go through the slides. So is there, for example, a risk for losing the income and the lamps? Well, probably there is. So then the question is, how big is that risk? And then there's another thing. You can, of course, look to an isolated consumer that has these lamps and see what the potential is that it goes bankrupt. But obviously you want to look at the bigger picture. So what if Philips or another lamp provider engages into 1 million of these contracts? How big is the risk then? And you can fairly easily estimate how many people go bankrupt and how relevant this risk actually may be. So looking at this macro test allows you to move beyond the individual case and bring it much further, and also see if you can deduce a risk premium that you can add to your contract to account for the risks that are attached to this bankruptcy. So that's really taking it from the macro perspective. And then we also thought about a more technical aspect to it, and that was what we referred to as the red button. So if Philips would be able to, from a distance, so remotely, have a switch that they can turn whenever a consumer doesn't pay anymore for the lamps that they have, if you can just switch them off remotely, then also for the liquidator, there will be a reason to start paying again. So there are several ways of looking at how big that bankruptcy risk actually is. And, well, really coming to a conclusion there, I think the bankruptcy and looking at it from a macro perspective already allows you to put it in perspective, and probably risks are relatively low. And another one that you could think of is a technical workaround, which really well, is an extra incentive for the liquidator to to continue adhering to the contract that you have in place. So I think that's the main things that I wanted to share with you before we open the floor also for discussion. And I hand it over to Arianna to see if we have some questions that have come in. I would really shortly like to summarize what we just explained. So one is that many of the suppliers currently are moving from a box pushing model to a pay-per-use. That the main reason for that is that they can still have an influence on those elements, so on the materials that they have. And in the case of lighting, this pay-per-use model has a consequence that when lamps are installed in a house, the supplier will lose legal ownership of the lamps through a cession, because the lamps are permanently fixed to the ceiling. And while this may be perceived to be a legal barrier, actually we have seen that a contract between supplier and consumer is actually a very strong and common way of going around that. And then in the case of bankruptcy, while that may pose several risks, also again looking at it from a macro perspective, and also looking at possible technology-driven solutions that you might have for that, is also a work around that. So that's basically why we called it, well, perceived between brackets for this for this session. Sometimes it might look like a legal barrier. Sometimes it's a perceived one, but we actually can conclude that with the current law that we have in place, we can come a very long way of introducing these kind of models. So Arianna.
Yeah, let's get us back on screen. There we are again. And yes, there are already some questions popping up here. So let's see if we can find good answers to them. So when speaking to legal and financial sectors, is the circular economy actually, or these sort of business models, are they well known? Is in your experience?
Yeah, well, I have the impression that they are, especially the pay per use for lighting example is a very common example when you talk about the circular economy. And in my impression, talking to these financial institutions, it's definitely well, they definitely know about it, and also have views about how they can play a role in facilitating in these kind of business models. So I definitely think that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah, or it's starting to become the case. I don't think it's like everyone knows about it, but the interest is definitely growing in the financial sector as well, as with legal institutions, I guess.
Definitely, yeah. Well, I think what we obviously we from Circular Economy are also talking to really the leading people within these institutions, thinking about
Sure.
this. So that also might be well, a bit misleading on my behalf. But I definitely think they're, well, to start think about this more, also how they can play a role in financing these kind of models.
Right. Yeah, and another question we have here is, how have leading circular economy businesses overcome real or perceived legal barriers? So we've just discussed the example of Philips, that's one, but we also have, well, Dassault Interface, for example.
Yeah. Well, then maybe to get back to the example that I started with, so in waste and how you can reuse waste, what I see currently, and it also has a background a bit in the bio-based economy, where you see that when you have organic waste streams coming available, that in the past there were a lot of laws and regulations that had to do with sanitation and other elements, that there were laws and regulations really prohibiting that for being transported to other locations or being processed in certain ways. And I've seen, for example, working with the waste incinerators in the Netherlands, but also with parties that go to biodigestion, also of discarded food waste. I think they've come a long way in well, finding the loopholes within current law and legislation, but also with finding and really being able to reshape these regulations also on a local level to make business cases and to make projects happen.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And another good question we receive is, we've been focusing on the legal barriers in this story and touching upon things that are actually maybe financial barriers. What are other main barriers that you think are currently blocking the way to circular business models?
Yeah, well, I think just from the top of my head, one is we're looking at metropolitan regions, like in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, and what you see there, what is really in the way is also like the transport and the ways in which people can be mobile, but also in how you can connect to one another,
yeah.
But also the boundary conditions that you have within cities to to move to new business models in a much broader sense. So related to infrastructure in its broader sense, and that might be over the road, but it might also be ICT infrastructure. So I think that's some of the examples there.
Definitely. And the challenge here for these kind of business models is always how to make them scalable, how to implement them at large scale. Do you have any examples of performance models, retaining ownerships, models that are successful at a larger scale that you've seen so far?
Well, I think the examples that I can think of real quick now are really on a relatively small scale. So you have a beautiful company called GladLease, for example, that is really trying to roll this out when it comes to lighting, and they're really, although growing fast, I think really still playing in a niche market. And then obviously in looking at leasing models, you have the leasing of cars, which is quite common. So you have quite established markets, but I would not necessarily call those the ones that really stem from this transition to a circular economy. So really where this small startup has already reached significant scale, I would not be able to come up with an example of that.
No, but I think that's an interesting remark, that a lot of these business models that we now call circular actually exist in some markets already. For example, the printing industry and the automotive industry, the leasing model is very normal. And
definitely.
Yeah, we've sort of reinvented it now as something for circular economy, but it's good that there are already some examples that were invented for other reasons that we can learn from. So looking at the financial system, is there anything that needs to be changed to make circular business models more successful, or do we need just tons of great cases to provide the evidence that it works?
Yeah, well, that's actually a great question, and I think in terms of the financial valuation of business cases, there is a lot that we can learn. So what you now see is that the payback times with which banks operate are usually very short, and also focused on really, the box pushing model, you might say, so really trying to get the products out there in the market. Whereas if you also already want to consider also the end of life, then the timelines of your projects and also of the financing become longer, but also in a way more complex. But on the other hand, it might also pose big opportunities. So, as I said, one of the arguments you could mention for such a model is that you retain or at least keep within your sphere of influence the materials that you bring onto the market, which allows you to also reuse those materials rather than being available of the very volatile market for that. And you could actually also put a price to that. So what is the price that you can take into account for that risk mitigation, you might say? That is very interesting, I think, to also include in business models up front. I know that banks are also seeing how they can make that happen, but at the same time we see that that's really very slow progress, you might say.
Yeah, and another thing that we have to look into is the sort of the mindset of the people working on this. So what do you think needs to change in people's mindsets to not perceive these barriers anymore, to be able to think beyond it. And this is what we've seen in the discussions with Ellen and Overy as well, that it's really also about that.
Well, one, I think, and that's also the whole reason why we started this project, is to have more deep dives on specific topics to, well, disentangle, to use that word, to see what is actually where we perceive this barrier, or where there's actually a barrier, and try to drill down to the actual place where it is a barrier, to see if it's, well, if it is one. And I think that's really what we have seen. So sitting together with and connecting also worlds. So in this case, a manufacturer, but also a legal company like Ellen and Overy, which have well, a lot of experience, mainly in other sectors, of looking at similar challenges and bringing together those worlds and learning from each other. And as we're doing today, sharing that in the public, but also discussing about it. I think that's the only way, at least, to get people better informed and to ask the really interesting but also crucial questions. So I think bringing worlds together and sharing this knowledge is really important. Yeah, and when it comes to the mindset, I think, well, as I already started also with during the presentation, with this disruptiveness, it is always about, well, forward-looking. So you're always operating in a system that's not ready for the change you want to see. And yeah, I think that has a lot to do with mindset. So having that more focused on the end of life, having that more focused on the longer term, are definitely ingredients that you want to mention there.
Right. And another question that pops here is, do you think that the financial sector's adjustments in trying to account for issues such as resource price volatility, I never know how to pronounce that, if that's a barrier to investment in circular models and their perceived competitiveness? So
let me reread this.
It's quite a long sentence. I was struggling as well.
A significant barrier to invest in circular models. Well, I mean, what I think, to turn it around a bit, it's a great opportunity that if you have a business model where you stay, well, let's say economic owner, or you keep materials within your own sphere of influence, you have a couple of opportunities. One is that the ownership resides with the party that knows best what to do with it, what's in those components, etc. And it can also be a clear, well, opportunity, because you become less dependent on that market. Whereas on the other hand, if prices are reduced on that world market, it's always possible for you to obtain them there. So you basically get more flexibility in a way. And I think accounting for building in that flexibility and, in a sense, also robustness, I think that's very, yeah, that's very crucial to do, but also a real opportunity.
Yeah, right. There's a question that just already moved off the screen, but I think it's very interesting, so I'm trying to remember it correctly. And that was about there's sort of the locality of the legal barriers or the legislation, because we've been looking into the Netherlands.
Yep.
There it is, back again. So how country or region based are these legal barriers?
Yeah.
Do you think?
Well, indeed. So we have looked mainly at Dutch law. Although I think that the concept that we discussed here, like accession and fixture and how that works, that basic concept is quite widespread, as we have been able to verify. But I think definitely when you move a bit outside of laws and regulations, but more into policies, then you see clear differences, and let me stay within the Netherlands, clear differences on a municipality, on a province, and on a national level, on a European level, that are sometimes also contradictory. So I think a relevant question also to ask is, on what level of region versus supranational level do you need to address questions and need to make changes to make things happen? And obviously, if that is on a local scale, it's much easier in a way to make those changes happen than if you need to have big changes made in Brussels, for example. So I think, yeah, that's part of answering the question. So yeah.
Yeah. So actually, the location or the scale really does matter in thinking about this. The last question popping up here, or if you have a final question for us, then please let us know. In addition to the perceived barriers, do you think there are real legal barriers, and what legislation changes are needed in your opinion? And maybe that's easiest to answer for our local case.
Yeah. Well, we actually identified one legal barrier, and that is in the case that I just mentioned, in the case where you have bankruptcy, where through a cession the lamps are part of the building. So the liquidator needs to, for example, sell the office building of the property, including the lamps. So he says, well, we're going to terminate the project with Philips, so we are now owner of the lamps. In selling that property, he might have a windfall profit because he can sell the property for a higher price because it now includes these beautiful lamps, for which he terminated the project. So in bankruptcy law, this is not really arranged, accounting for the windfall profits that a party might have. So this is actually one of the real legal barriers that we came across. So yeah, that's one to mention that now comes to my mind.
Yeah, and I think what's also great to mention here is that we're actually discussing these barriers with some of our ministries as well, and they're very responsive in seeing what they can do. So hopefully we can make some big steps here in the Netherlands towards enabling circular business models. Well, I think that's it for today from our side. If you have more questions, you can always reach us via Twitter, via our website, or whatever. Joe, I really want to thank you a lot for hosting us today. It was great to be part of the festival, and of course we also want to thank Seeds to Meet, where we were able to use their Google Hangout studio. So back to you, Joe. Thanks.
Also, thanks from my side.
Thank you very much, guys, for that really interesting presentation and answering the questions on the perceived legal barriers to the circular economy. Yeah, it's clear that it's a mixed landscape at the moment. There are some things that do need to be overcome, but also there's a lot that we can that businesses can do right now, and that certainly reflects what has been said in the various publications towards the circular economy reports and elsewhere on the topic of the circular economy. So thank you. Thank you to everyone as well who's joined the session today and for asking your questions. We do stick around at the Disruptive Innovation Festival. We've got headline acts that you can catch up on from earlier this week. Eben Bayer from Ecovative speaking on how he built a circular economy business, or pretty much as close as we can see with his mycelium-based packaging. William Madonna, one of the founders of the Cradle to Cradle design principles and the C2C movement, speaking earlier this week. You can also catch up on his recorded session. And last night we heard from Jeremy Rifkin in a very engaging talk on the third industrial revolution. Again, it's been recorded and you can catch it on thinkdiff.co. Tune into the Disruptive Innovation Festival next week. We've got our first headliner on Monday. It takes place at 12 noon GMT, and it'll be with Mark Miodownik. He's the director of the Institute of Making. It's a department in the University College London, which focuses on the importance of materials and making in the economy. He'll be talking about the Institute of Making's new digital materials library. It's a free app that you can download now from the iOS App Store, and it highlights the importance of materials in how we live and make products today, and how we'll be making things in the circular economy as well. So thank you again to everyone who's joined today. We hope to see you at the next DIF session. Thanks.